In my last two videos, I explained the nature and scope of the synoptic problem and critiqued the arguments which undergird the foundation of most modern synoptic hypotheses, the theory of Markan priority. In this video, I begin the task of building a positive case for an alternative hypothesis. In my next video, we will explore the internal evidence which strongly suggests that Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels first and that Mark was written last. But for now, I want to leave those sorts of considerations aside and examine a different category of evidence. In this video, I want to see what sort of synoptic theory we arrive at if we only consider what our earliest witnesses have to say about the composition of the Gospels. While modern scholars tend to ignore or discredit this evidence, the early church had quite a lot to say about the composition of the Gospels. David Black captures the situation rather well when he says, "The patristic evidence for the authenticity and historicity of the Gospels is not normally discussed nowadays at any length, if at all, by Markan priorists. Today, the academic guild, both in Europe and North America, assumes that the patristic evidence is basically legendary and unreliable." Martin Mosse likewise laments the situation, saying, "There appears to be a consensus that, if conclusions reached from source criticism conflict with the witness of the early church, then the latter can be dismissed with the lamest of explanations, or sometimes without any explanation at all. Papias thus becomes the primary whipping boy when the early fathers' belief that Matthew wrote first is thought to conflict with the generally accepted priority of Mark. Goodacre, evidently embarrassed by this conflict, is more horrifyingly forthright than most, saying, 'It will be most prudent to continue to treat the patristic witness with a pinch of salt.' I doubt, however, whether the optimal approach to any historical problem is to jettison all the available ancient evidence at the outset. Discrediting the early fathers simply raises the unanswered, and indeed usually unasked, question, how did they all come to be so wrong? This video will survey the writings of the early church fathers which have bearing on the writing of the Gospels. After each quotation is supplied, I will explain what is and what is not said about the order of the Gospel's composition. At the end, we will see what sort of synoptic theory emerges if we just let the early church speak without considering any internal evidence. Papias of Hierapolis is our oldest witness to discuss the writing of the Gospels. Writing in the later 1st or early 2nd century, Papias wrote, "The elder used to say, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. So then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." While Papias does supply us with valuable information regarding the circumstances in which Matthew and Mark were written, and despite attempts from both Matthean and Markan priorists to claim Papias in support of their respective synoptic theories, a careful reading of Papias will reveal that he tells us nothing regarding the order in which the Gospels were written. As William Farmer concludes, one can safely conclude little, if anything, about the sequence in which the Gospels were composed from the words of Papias. However, Papias does seem to say that Matthew's Gospel was originally composed in Hebrew, something which has relentlessly nagged at scholars. We will return to this question near the end of the video. Our next witness is Irenaeus of Lyons. Writing in the mid-2nd century, Irenaeus wrote, "Matthew also issued a gospel written among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." Irenaeus tells us in no uncertain terms that Mark was written after Matthew, and that John was the last gospel to have been written. While he lists Luke third, a careful reading of Irenaeus will reveal that he doesn't actually say anything about the order in which Luke was written. As Farmer correctly observes, It seems most natural to understand Irenaeus to imply that Luke, as well as Mark, composed his gospel after the death of Peter and Paul. However, there is no indication of any sequential relationship between Mark and Luke. And once again, Irenaeus seems to agree with Papias that the Gospel of Matthew was originally composed in Hebrew. From Irenaeus' words, we can begin forming a synoptic theory. Matthew, possibly in Hebrew, was written first. Mark and Luke are both clearly later than Matthew, but Irenaeus does not tell us in which order they stand to one another. John is clearly written last. A third witness is Clement of Alexandria. Writing in the later 2nd century, he said, "The earliest written Gospels were those containing the genealogies, and the Gospel according to Mark came into being in this manner. Mark, the follower of Peter, while Peter was publicly preaching the gospel at Rome in the presence of some of Caesar's knights and uttering many testimonies about Christ, on their asking him to let them have a record of the things that had been said, wrote the gospel that is called the Gospel of Mark from the things said by Peter, just as Luke is recognized as the pen that wrote the Acts of the Apostles as the translator of the letter of Paul to the Hebrews." Clement leaves no doubt that Matthew and Luke were written first, as these are the two Gospels which contain genealogies. While Clement does not tell us whether Matthew or Luke was first, Irenaeus has already given us the answer to this question. Thus, Matthew is first, Luke emerges as being second, leaving Mark as being third. Some have maintained that Clement contradicts Irenaeus on when the Gospel of Mark was written. While Irenaeus says that Mark handed down his gospel after the departure of Peter and Paul, which is very likely a reference to their deaths, Clement says that Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was still preaching in Rome, meaning that Peter was still alive. The apparent contradiction, however, is only superficial. Upon a closer reading, it is evident that Mark's gospel was written during Peter's lifetime, specifically for the Praetorian Guard, as Clement says, and that it was only handed on to believers in general after Peter and Paul's death, as Irenaeus says. In fact, the two accounts are perfectly harmonious. As Bernard Orchard concludes, Irenaeus is not making any reference to the date of the composition of Mark and Luke. He is simply concerned with pointing out that, just as the traditions of Matthew and John continue to live on in their respective Gospels, so do those of Peter and Paul in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. That is to say, as long as Peter and Paul lived, they preached their own Gospels personally by word of mouth, but after their demise, their preaching also continued in the Gospels in which their followers had already recorded their teaching. In conclusion, this text of Irenaeus, recorded by Eusebius in its original Greek, should no longer be claimed in support of the conjecture that both Mark and Luke were composed after the death of Peter and Paul, for it offers no evidence for this claim. This means that there is no contradiction or discrepancy between the testimony of Irenaeus and the large amount of witness in favor of Mark and Luke having both been written and published during the lifetime of Peter and Paul. Consequently, the evidence of Irenaeus is in harmony with the rest. Given the clear support which Clement's statements provide for the two-gospel hypothesis, it is not surprising that some scholars, such as Helmut Merkel, have tried to explain away Clement's testimony. Merkel theorizes that Clement originally didn't know about Mark's gospel, and so he later interpolated his own writings to sandwich the story of Mark's composition between his references to Matthew and Luke and his reference to John, giving the unintentional impression that Mark was the third gospel to have been written. Truly, this theory is hard to take seriously. It lacks any supporting evidence, and it smacks of desperation to explain away the clear evidence that Mark was written third. As Bernard Orchard points out in response to Merkel, these suggestions, though ingenious, are hardly convincing. We know that Papias knew of Luke and John as well as Matthew and Mark because he wrote commentaries on the former two. It is moreover incredible that the learned men whom Clement sought out, from whom he learned the apostolic tradition from the ancient elders regarding the fact that the Gospels with genealogies were written before those without, would not themselves have known of the four canonical Gospels. All four had long since been circulating widely in Asia as well as elsewhere. Such arguments are little more than grasping at straws. Our fourth witness is Tertullian. Writing in the very early 3rd century, he said, I lay it down to begin with that the documents of the gospel have the apostles for their authors, and that this task of promulgating the gospel was imposed upon them by the Lord himself. In short, from among the apostles, John and Matthew implant in us the faith, while from among the apostolic men, Luke and Mark reaffirm it. Many have thought that Tertullian is here claiming that Matthew and John were written first, and that Luke and Mark were written later. However, this interpretation is hardly required by Tertullian's words. A careful reading will show that Tertullian regards Matthew and John as being the primary sources of faith due to being direct apostles of Jesus, whereas Luke and Mark play a role of confirmation in light of their being followers of the apostles. Unfortunately, Tertullian just doesn't tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels were written. A fifth witness is Origen. He tells us that, among the four Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the first written was that according to Matthew, who was once a tax collector, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it for those who from Judaism came to believe, composed as it was in the Hebrew language. Secondly, that according to Mark, who composed it in accordance with the instructions of Peter, who in the Catholic epistle acknowledges him as a son. And thirdly, that according to Luke, for those who from the Gentiles came to believe. After them all, that according to John. Origen is quite clear that Matthew was written first and John last. At first blush, Origen seems to be saying that Mark was written second and Luke third, and it is quite possible that this is what he means. But it cannot be denied that Origen's language is less decisive in the case of Mark and Luke. He does not explicitly state that the words secondly and thirdly refer to the order of the writing with respect to Mark and Luke. Potentially, this may refer to their canonical order rather than their chronological order. As Farmer says, it is possible that when Origen systematically moves from first to second to third and last of all, he does not himself think of this as the historical order in which these Gospels were composed. However, this is a mere possibility. It must be admitted that Origen most naturally reads as saying that Mark was written prior to Luke, in view of his definitively chronological language with respect to Matthew and John. The sixth and final witness is St. Augustine. He writes, "Now those four evangelists, whose names have gained the most remarkable circulation over the whole world, and whose number has been fixed as 4, are believed to have written in the order which follows: first Matthew, then Mark, thirdly Luke, lastly John." Augustine agrees with the previous witnesses on the priority of Matthew and the posteriority of John. There is no question that Augustine regards Mark as second and Luke as third in this passage. However, it is possible that he depended upon Origen for this information, and that he later changed his mind about the order. For later in his life, when discussing the relationships of the Gospels to one another, Augustine also wrote, "Mark either appears to be preferentially the companion of Matthew, or else he holds a course in conjunction with both." Augustine is here referring to the content of Mark's Gospel as having a clear preference for Matthew's wording. However, he also says that Mark sometimes follows both. Given that Augustine is differentiating Mark from Matthew and Luke in this context, it seems reasonable to interpret his use of the word both as meaning both Matthew and Luke. But if this is right, then Augustine must believe that both Matthew and Luke were written prior to Mark. For in order for Mark to follow them, they must have preceded Mark. Thus it appears that Augustine changed his mind on the order of the Synoptic Gospels. As David Peabody argues, it appears that what Augustine says about Mark's relationship to Luke, both at the personal and at the thematic levels in Book 1, are different from what he says about these same relationships in Book 4. But whatever the textual evidence which Augustine may have had in mind in Book 4, it was sufficient to lead him to a new understanding of Mark which he did not have in Book 1. In Book 4, it is the textual relationship among the Synoptics that demonstrate that Mark unites the Gospel of Matthew with the Gospel of Luke at the thematic and at the symbolic levels. Thus, Augustine yields two synoptic orders. In both, he maintains the priority of Matthew, with John's Gospel being written last. His earlier writings leave no doubt that he once believed Mark to have preceded Luke, but this can be easily explained by reference to Augustine's dependence upon Origen for this tradition. His later writings seem to suggest that his own analysis of the Synoptic Gospels led him to change his mind and place Luke before Mark. When we lay out what all of the earliest patristic witnesses have to say, there are several unanimous agreements. All agree on the priority of Matthew, though some appear to say that it was originally written in Hebrew, and all agree on John being written last. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that there is some apparent disagreement on the order of Luke and Mark. While Irenaeus' words are inconclusive, and Augustine appears to have changed his mind, Clement and Origen both seem pretty emphatic on their respective orders, and these orders are inconsistent. A good rule of historical inquiry, when sources conflict, is to prefer the older source when all other things stand equal between them. Since Clement was closer to the writing of the Gospels than Origen, it will be most prudent to prefer his order until strong reasons are put forward for preferring Origen's later order. When the Church Fathers are allowed to have a voice and we attempt to take their testimony seriously, the most consistent overall synoptic theory which emerges is as follows: Matthew first, Luke second, Mark third. In short, the two-gospel or Dreisbach hypothesis is the best supported hypothesis by the external evidence pertinent to the synoptic problem. As noted earlier, many of the patristic witnesses seem to indicate that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. A long-standing objection to this is that the canonical Gospel of Matthew could not have originally been translated from Hebrew. Now, first and foremost, it should be pointed out that one need not say that canonical Matthew is a word-for-word translation of a Hebrew original. After all, an early Hebrew Gospel could have very easily been expanded upon and improved in a later Greek edition. So the proponent of a Hebrew Matthew is not committed to believing that our canonical Matthew is an exact translation of a Hebrew Gospel. But with that being said, how strong is the case against believing that canonical Matthew could not have been translated from a Hebrew original, as Papias possibly indicates when he says that everyone translated or interpreted them as he was able? The arguments against this are less than conclusive. Let us consider some of the arguments of J.R.C. Kuesland. Kuesland argues that, despite scholarly efforts to detect an underlying Aramaic original for Mark or Matthew, it is probable that all the evangelists wrote in the common Greek of their day. Further, the vast majority of Hebrew Bible citations in the New Testament are taken from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. Kuesland first states that it is probable that Matthew originally wrote in Greek, but he does not supply any supporting evidence which would render this conclusion probable. He also notes that most of the citations from the Old Testament in Matthew are from the Greek Septuagint. I take his implication to be that this somehow makes it unlikely that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, since it would be inconsistent for a Hebrew work to cite a Greek translation of Scripture. If this is indeed Kuesland's intended point, then it seems relatively easy to circumvent it. On the assumption that Matthew originally was a Hebrew work, then it is reasonable to assume that the Old Testament citations were originally from the Hebrew Masoretic text. When the hypothetical translation was taking place, it clearly would have been more efficient for the translator to simply adopt the Septuagint translation of Matthew's Old Testament references rather than attempting to translate these verses into Greek himself. After all, why bother translating these verses into Greek if that has already been done? Another skeptic of a Hebrew Matthew is Dale Martin. He argues, Papias, for example, also thought that the Gospel of Matthew had originally been written in Hebrew and only later had been translated into Greek. That is wrong. It is clear to modern scholars that Matthew is written in Greek. It shows no signs of being a translation from Hebrew, and in some instances, it makes a point by using Greek words that cannot have been translations from Hebrew. Martin's only argument that it is impossible for Matthew to have been translated from Hebrew to Greek is that Matthew's Gospel contains Greek words which don't have Hebrew equivalents. Unfortunately, he supplies no examples of this, so it's difficult to know exactly how to respond to Martin. Suffice to say that translation is rarely ever a direct word-for-word copying from one language into another, precisely because some words don't have exact equivalents in the other language, and because things like figures of speech don't always carry over into another language. Even if Matthew's Gospel contains Greek words which don't have exact Hebrew equivalents, it is very dubious to think that whatever is expressed in Greek in Matthew's Gospel could not have been expressed in Hebrew at all. It is often objected that we have no surviving manuscript evidence for a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, but this objection fails to consider that the vast majority of works written in the ancient past have not survived until the present. Given that a gospel written in Hebrew would not have been as widely used as a Greek gospel, it is not surprising that a Hebrew gospel would not have survived until the present day. Moreover, it is perfectly legitimate to postulate the existence of documents which are no longer extant when there is strong evidence that they once existed. This is exactly what the hypothetical Q source is supposed to be. If there is nothing illegitimate about postulating Q in the absence of any textual evidence for this document, as the majority of scholars do, then there cannot be anything wrong with postulating a Hebrew Matthew in the absence of any textual evidence for this document. Indeed, if we are reading Papias and Irenaeus correctly, the hypothesis that there was a Hebrew Matthew at least has testimonial evidence in its favor. The same cannot be said for the Q document, unless of course one wants to suppose that these are one and the same. Beyond this, we know that plenty of documents which were originally written in Hebrew were later translated into Greek around this time. As Sang-Bok argues, there are similar instances in the history of literature which might add credence to the possibility of such translation. In the 3rd century BC, the entire Old Testament was reproduced in Greek. 1st Maccabees was first written in Hebrew, but the original Hebrew text was lost at a very early date. There is no evidence of its use by any early writer. The earliest version is preserved only in Greek. Furthermore, it was already noted that Josephus composed the Wars of the Jews in Hebrew at first, but reproduced it in a Greek edition, and today there is no trace of the original text. With all that being said, it is also possible that we have misunderstood Papias this entire time. There is another possible interpretation of what he said with respect to Matthew's Gospel. While most translations of Papias render him as saying that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language, the word he uses is dialecto, and it can also be legitimately translated as style or dialect. As Bernard Orchard explains, in the 1st century, dialecto commonly meant both language and style, so that our phrase could mean either in a Jewish language or in a Jewish style, depending on the context. Under this interpretation, Papias would be saying that Matthew wrote his gospel not in the Hebrew language, but in a Hebrew style. It is certainly not controversial that Matthew's Gospel is the most Jewish of the Synoptics in terms of familiarity with Jewish customs and messianic emphasis. Robert Gundry argues that the context of Papias' quotation of the elder John favors this understanding. In his statement quoted by Papias, the elder shows concern over Mark's style, particularly over the disorderly way the single points concerning Jesus' ministry appear in the Gospel of Mark. This concern favors a similar frame of reference in the statement about Matthew, whose writing, by contrast, exhibits orderliness. This contrast comes out clearly in the elder's parallelistic use of the verb arranged to describe what Matthew did do with the Lord's oracles, and of the cognate noun arrangement to describe what Mark, following Peter, did not do with the Lord's oracles. Furthermore, the elder says nothing at all about the linguistic form of Mark, which he ought to mention if it is his intention to introduce, by way of contrast, a different linguistic form in Matthew. Apparently, Matthew does not have a linguistic form different from Mark's Greek. A Hebrew dialect, then, does not imply that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic language. Gundry's argument is strong, but there is still the difficulty of Papias going on to say that everyone translated or interpreted Matthew's writings as best they could, which indicates some sort of language barrier. As Jeremiah Tritle points out, it is thus plausible that Papias believed that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language, given that others had to translate it as they were able. It is, therefore, impossible to definitively say one way or the other whether or not the earliest patristic witnesses testify to a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew or not. But what is very clear is that they all agree that Matthew, in some form or another, was written first. As even Mark Goodacre affirms, there is something rather troubling about the case for Mark in priority, a niggling difficulty that contradicts the scholarly consensus, the external evidence. All the early Christian writers who expressed an opinion from the late 2nd century onwards pronounced in favor of the priority of Matthew. There is a genuine consensus here, a consensus far stronger than the current scholarly one concerning the priority of Mark. Goodacre goes on to say that this consensus is not enough to overturn the overwhelming internal evidence for the priority of Mark, so the patristic witness must just be wrong on this point. However, as shown in my last video, the evidence for Markan priority is inconclusive at best. Goodacre's only attempt to explain how the patristics might have gotten this detail wrong is to hypothesize that Matthew was an apostle of Jesus, and so, of course, the early church must have thought his gospel was written first. The fathers wanted to demonstrate that the 4 gospels they favored were written by the apostles, or, at the very least, under the influence of the apostles. The relative dates given to the gospels then arose largely as a consequence of prior decisions on the identity of the authors. From the 2nd century onwards, Matthew was not only the most popular gospel, but it was also the one that bore the name of an apostle. Mark and Luke, on the other hand, did not bear the names of apostles, and were thought to have been written by the companions of Peter and Paul, respectively. The priority of Matthew was a natural consequence of the belief that his gospel was the one directly written by an apostle. Leaving aside the fact that we have no particular reason to think that any of the patristics made such an egregious leap in logic from Matthew's apostolicity to his gospel's priority, there is a serious problem with Goodacre's reasoning here. The patristics also unanimously place John's gospel last. If we are to accept Goodacre's assumption that the patristics believed that a gospel had temporal priority in virtue of having been written by an apostle, then John's gospel ought to be placed alongside Matthew's as being one of the first gospels to have been written, and yet it is unanimously placed last. This calls into question Goodacre's idea that the patristics were so dim-witted as to assume that a gospel must have been written earlier if it was written by an apostle. And so the question remains for the proponent of Markan priority. How did each and every one of the patristics manage to get the order of the Synoptic Gospels so wrong? Bernard Orchard concludes the matter rather well. Our conclusion must be that the patristic evidence has been for too long underrated and neglected, and that properly understood, it can prove to be of the greatest value in helping us to understand the circumstances surrounding the original composition of the Gospel of Mark, as well as pointing us toward the proper solution to the synoptic question. In this video, we have surveyed the external evidence for the priority of Matthew in general and for the 2 gospel hypothesis in particular. We have seen that the early church was unanimous on Matthew having been written first. Furthermore, despite some possible disagreement with respect to the order of Mark and Luke, the external evidence also favors viewing Mark as being subsequent to Luke. This evidence for the 2 gospel hypothesis is weighty and must be taken seriously. However, it is only the first leg upon which the 2 gospel hypothesis stands. In my next video, I will show how the evidence within the synoptic gospels also favors the 2 gospel hypothesis.